Tiu de Chin. My parents demanded I deed my $800,000 home to my brother, but my lawyer's cackle changed everything. Van Dyke. Bomi doi tua sang ten goi na 800 non du cho entree and hung tiang koi qua, lutsu qua tua de the doi tatsie. Don't text them now. I refuse to deed my $800,000 restored home over to my brother. So my parents threatened court action, hissing, "We own your success." But my lawyer chuckled. The aftermath destroyed them. Van Dyke. Tua tu choi sang ten goi na duok fuk che tri jia 800 k cho entree. Vive bomi toi de dioe kien are toa va rit len chung ta so hu ton song qua mai. And hung lut su qua toi de koi kuk kich. How qua de tu diet ho. I refuse to deed my $800,000 restored home over to my brother. So my parents threatened court action, hissing, "We own your success." But my lawyer chuckled. The aftermath destroyed them. My name is Cora. I am 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my entire existence within my family has been defined by a broom, a dustpan, and an apology I never actually owed. I was born into a role I never auditioned for, a title that carried absolutely zero pay, zero benefits, and definitely zero respect. I was the designated cleanup crew. It meant that whenever things got messy, whenever someone broke something, or whenever an uncomfortable, heavy silence descended upon a room, everyone immediately turned to look at me to fix it. This particular night, the silence was thicker than the overcooked, dry roast beef sitting on my plate. It was the obligatory monthly family dinner. My parents, Victor and Rose, insisted on this gathering every single month. They packaged it and sold it under the wholesome label of family time. But all of us sitting at that table knew exactly what it really was. It was a performance. It was a carefully directed stage show where they could preside over their little kingdom and reassure themselves of their own grandiosity. Their house was immaculate, but not in a welcoming way. It was clean in that cold, sterile way that immediately signals to you that no one actually lives there, no one truly breathes or relaxes within those walls. The entire place constantly smelled of artificial lemon polish, a desperate chemical attempt to cover up the distinct scent of emotional dust and decay. Every laugh shared in that dining room always sounded just a little too rehearsed, like actors who had forgotten their underlying motivation, but memorized the script. I call it emotional bankruptcy. They had all the expensive furniture, the high-end appliances, and the perfect lawn, but the account holding their genuine empathy was overdrawn by decades. I sat at my usual designated spot at the corner of the long mahogany table, slowly nursing a glass of red wine I didn't even really want to drink. At the head of the table sat my father, Victor. He cleared his throat. It was a highly specific, low, booming noise that he had perfected over the years. It wasn't a cough to clear an itch, it was a loud proclamation. It was an auditory cue that demanded, "Listen to me right now, I am the center of the universe." Beside him sat my mother, Rose. She offered a tight, thin smile that stretched across her face, but never, ever reached her cold eyes. She wore a string of heavy pearls around her neck, treating them less like jewelry and more like a suit of armor to eat dinner in. They clicked softly against each other every time she turned her head to judge something. And then, sitting directly across from me, was my older brother, Wyatt. Wyatt is 34 years old, 2 years my senior, and holds the undisputed, lifelong title of the Certified Golden Boy. Even in his mid-30s, he still wears the exact same lazy, deeply entitled smirk he had when he was an 8-year-old kid. It is the specific smirk of someone who knows they just got away with murder and fully expects you to help them bury the evidence. Next to Wyatt sat his new fiancée, Piper. Piper was the only newcomer to this bizarre little psychological play. She looked visibly nervous, constantly fiddling with her cloth napkin, her eyes darting around the room like a hostage who slowly suspects that this fancy dinner party might actually be a trap. She just didn't know yet who the trap was meant for. The fake, polite dinner party chatter suddenly died. The sudden vacuum of sound was deliberate. Victor shifted in his heavy leather chair and fixed his gaze directly on me. "Cora," he boomed, letting the name hang in the air for a second. "About that property." That little renovation project you have been working on all these years. I felt an immediate, familiar cold not form in the pit of my stomach. I knew this specific tone of voice intimately. This was the tone Victor used when he wasn't asking a question. He was making a declaration. He was informing the room of a new reality he had just mentally constructed. "The house," I replied, keeping my voice entirely flat, giving him absolutely no emotional supply to feed on. My mother, Rose, immediately jumped in, her voice dripping with an artificial, sugary sweetness that made my teeth ache. "We were just talking, your father and I, Wyatt and Piper. Well, they are going to need a very strong start. A proper, solid foundation for their new married life together." I slowly looked over at Wyatt. He wasn't even looking at me. He was casually inspecting his fingernails, that lazy, infuriating smirk still firmly plastered on his face. He looked bored, like he was merely waiting for a transaction to be completed. "It is a wonderful house, Cora. Truly, what you have done with it," Rose continued, her tone patronizing. "It is quite substantial now. Very substantial. Substantial." That was a brand new word in their vocabulary regarding my life. For 5 entire years, they had actively referred to my house as a dump, a money pit, a foolish delusion, and Cora's little garbage project. Now, suddenly, because it held value, it was substantial. Recently, the property had been officially appraised at $800,000. A fact I foolishly mentioned in passing weeks ago, completely underestimating their boundless greed. Victor leaned forward, placing both of his elbows heavily on the table. "Wyatt needs that house significantly more than you do, Cora. He is a man starting a real family. You are single. You understand how this works." He said it just like that. Without a single stutter, without a drop of shame. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the statement seemed to suck the oxygen straight out of the dining room. Rose confidently raised her wine glass in the air. "So, it is completely settled then. You will sign the deed of the house over to your brother by the end of the month. We are all just so incredibly proud of you for being so selfless and doing the right thing for the family." A soft ripple of practiced, polite laughter circled the table. They were already toasting. They were literally raising their expensive glasses to toast my forced obedience, my total submission. The expensive crystal chandelier hummed quietly above us, catching the warm light in my half-empty wine glass. I stared down at it. I watched the dark red liquid tremble, catching the tiny, invisible vibrations from the immense psychological pressure building inside that room. This was the absolute culmination of 32 years of swallowing my own voice just so they could remain perfectly comfortable in their delusions. 32 years of cleaning up their messes, both emotionally and literally. I slowly picked up the wine glass by the stem. The entire room went dead silent, every pair of eyes watching my hands, waiting for me to take a sip, waiting for my silent agreement. Instead, I hovered the glass over the table. Then I set it back down. Very slowly, very deliberately, right onto the center of the coaster. The small, sharp clack of the glass hitting the wood echoed violently in the dead silence. I looked directly into my father's eyes. I shifted my gaze to look directly into my mother's eyes. Finally, I looked across the table at my brother, forcing him to stop looking at his fingernails and meet my stare. "No." The word was quiet. It was incredibly calm. It wasn't a desperate shout, and it didn't need to be. But in that sterile, carefully controlled environment, that single syllable landed like a live grenade. Rose's breath hitched audibly in her throat. Victor's jaw twitched, just a single, dangerous spasm of a muscle. Across the table, Wyatt's silver fork slipped from his grip and clattered loudly onto his ceramic plate. Piper simply looked terrified, staring at me like I had just grown a second head. The stage play was officially over. The heavy velvet curtains had caught fire. The battle lines were officially drawn, and the heavy, ringing silence that followed was deeply, painfully familiar to me. That specific, suffocating silence in the dining room transported me backward in time with violent force. It pulled me straight back to being an 8-year-old girl standing in a hallway. This was always our family's twisted rhythm. Wyatt would make the noise, he would cause the destruction, and I was expected to bring the silence and the broom to sweep away his consequences. I remember the first major incident with crystal clarity. I was 8 and Wyatt was 10. I was sitting quietly in my bedroom, reading a library book, when I heard a massive, shattering crash echo from the formal living room. I dropped my book and ran out. There it was. My grandmother's absolute favorite picture frame, an ornate, heavy silver antique with intricate details, lay completely shattered on the pristine hardwood floor. Shards of sharp glass were scattered everywhere, glinting in the afternoon sunlight. Wyatt stood frozen in the doorway leading to the kitchen, his eyes wide with a brief flicker of panic. He was holding a heavy baseball. "It just fell off the shelf by itself," he lied. His voice was already dripping with that sickly sweet, false innocence he would go on to perfect in his adult life. I knew immediately that he had been carelessly throwing the hard baseball against the wall indoors, something Victor explicitly forbade. But as I looked at the broken glass, I also knew a darker truth. It did not matter who broke it. If Victor came home to a mess, his wrath would be blind and terrifying. "Dad is home in 20 minutes, I whispered, panic rising in my small chest. Wyatt didn't move to help. He just shrugged and walked away to turn on the television. I frantically sprinted to the kitchen, grabbed the red plastic dustpan and the stiff brush, and ran back. I dropped to my knees on the hardwood floor and began sweeping. My small hands were shaking uncontrollably. I was so terrified I would miss a tiny, invisible shard and Victor would step on it. In my panicked rushing, I pressed my bare palm down to gather the pile, and a jagged piece of glass sliced deep into the meat of my hand. I gasped, watching thick drops of blood mix with the dust, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I wrapped my bleeding hand in the bottom of my t-shirt and kept sweeping with the other. I hid the ruined picture in a cheap wooden frame from my room and threw the bloody glass into the outside trash can. When Victor walked through the front door, Wyatt was comfortably sprawled on the couch watching cartoons. I was standing nervously in the kitchen, holding a wet rag over my throbbing hand. Rose walked in, saw the red plastic dustpan left on the counter, and frowned in disgust. "Make sure you put your cleaning supplies away, Cora," she snapped, completely ignoring my bloody shirt. From the living room, 10-year-old Wyatt yelled out over the sound of the TV, "Yeah, Cora is the cleanup crew." He let out this high, piping, cruel laugh. I remember standing there, my hand throbbing with pain, and I forced myself to smile. I smiled just so he wouldn't stop laughing, just so the tension in the house would break, just so I could disappear back into the background where I belonged. For years later, when I was 12 and Wyatt was 14, the disparity shifted from emotional neglect to blatant financial sabotage. I had spent an entire summer doing chores for neighbors to buy a second-hand, pale blue bicycle. I loved that bike. One afternoon, Wyatt decided he needed to go to a friend's house. Without asking, he took my blue bike. Half an hour later, he came walking back up the driveway, laughing. He had recklessly crashed it straight into a heavy brick mailbox at the end of the street, completely bending the front wheel into a twisted, unrideable pretzel shape. I ran down the street and found my prized possession crumpled on the curb, the chain snapped, the paint severely scratched. I dragged it home, crying silently. When Victor got home from the office, he took one look at Wyatt's slightly scraped knee, and then glared annoyed at my ruined bicycle leaning against the garage. He let out a heavy, irritated sigh, as if my sadness was a massive inconvenience to his evening. He didn't say a word to me. Instead, that exact same afternoon, he told Wyatt to get in the car. He drove Wyatt straight to the sporting goods store and bought him a brand new, expensive, matte black 10-speed mountain bike. To make him feel better about his scraped knee, my twisted blue bicycle was left leaning against the curb. It sat there, slowly rusting in the rain and the sun for 2 entire years before the city garbage collection finally took it away. Every single day I walked past it to take the school bus. It served as a rusted, decaying monument to my exact worth in that family. I constantly told myself it didn't matter. But it always did. By the time I reached my 20s, the vast disparity in how Wyatt and I were treated was no longer just a series of unfortunate childhood accidents. It was a fully established, structural reality of my existence. I had long realized that in the economy of our family, Wyatt was the sole beneficiary of all investments, and I was the designated shock absorber for his failures. When it came time for higher education, the rules were predictably rewritten. Wyatt, completely funded by Victor and Rose's seemingly bottomless bank accounts, enrolled in an expensive out-of-state university. He spent his first 2 semesters partying relentlessly, attending a fraction of his classes, and ultimately failing out with a completely wrecked grade point average. He returned home to his childhood bedroom, unbothered and unapologetic. Victor and Rose's response to this massive academic and financial failure? They bought him a brand new, silver sedan to, in their exact words, encourage him to get back on his feet and commute to a local community college. My path, however, was fundamentally different. When I received my acceptance letter to a solid state university, Victor sat me down at the same mahogany dining table and informed me that due to sudden, unforeseen market fluctuations, they unfortunately could not provide any financial assistance for my tuition or housing. The money simply wasn't there for me. It was a lie, of course, but it was a lie I had no power to fight. So I adapted. I am nothing if not highly adaptable. I enrolled in the local community college to knock out my core credits cheaply. I worked full-time as a shift manager at a coffee shop, pulling opening shifts at 4 in the morning before rushing to morning lectures. I took out student loans in my own name to cover the rest. I studied late into the night, fueled by a potent mix of cheap caffeine and a burning, quiet rage. Because I was forced to balance a 40-hour work week with a full course load, it took me longer than the standard 4 years. But I did it. At 25 years old, I finally walked across the stage and graduated with honors, earning a degree in communications with a minor in behavioral psychology. I chose behavioral psychology specifically because I desperately needed to understand the mechanics of the people who raised me. I needed the clinical vocabulary, narcissistic supply, cognitive dissonance, emotional manipulation to prove to myself that I wasn't the crazy one. We had a small, remarkably tense dinner at a local restaurant to celebrate my graduation. Wyatt, who was still casually taking 1 class a semester and working part-time, looked bored out of his mind. After the dessert plates were cleared, Victor stood up to present me with my graduation gift. He walked over to the trunk of his car and hauled out a large, incredibly heavy, industrial-grade metal toolbox. He dropped it onto the floor next to my chair with a loud thud. "Open it," he commanded. Inside were wrenches, hammers, a power drill, and assorted hardware. It was an expensive set, undoubtedly. But it wasn't a gift for a college graduate stepping into a professional career. Victor looked down at me, his face completely serious. "This suits you much better than a desk job, Cora. You've always been so good at fixing broken things around the house. You're practical." He meant it as a compliment. In his twisted, warped worldview, he was praising my utility. But as a 25-year-old woman holding a fresh university degree, looking down at a box of heavy metal tools while my brother twirled the keys to his fully paid-for sedan, I finally achieved total clarity. I looked at that heavy toolbox, I looked at Victor's self-satisfied face, and the last, stubborn remnant of childish hope inside me simply died. I finally understood. I stopped expecting fairness. I stopped asking for equality. I stopped waiting for them to look at me and see a daughter instead of a free contractor. I just stopped. I took the toolbox, I said thank you, and I began mentally building a massive brick wall around my emotional core. Every single day, I added another brick. I was completely insulating myself, not realizing at the time that while a wall protects you from the outside world, it also perfectly functions as the walls of your own lonely prison. If there was one single, fragile lifeline in the turbulent, highly toxic ocean of my childhood, it was my Grandma Opal. She was Rose's mother, but looking at them, you would never guess they shared a single drop of DNA. Where Rose was loud, demanding, and constantly obsessed with the superficial perception of wealth, Grandma Opal was incredibly quiet, deeply grounded, and entirely unimpressed by anything that could be bought with a credit card. Opal lived in a small, slightly weathered bungalow on the edge of town, surrounded by a wild, overgrown garden. She smelled permanently of rich, damp potting soil, dried lavender, and warm chamomile tea. When the shouting in my parents' house reached a fever pitch, or when the suffocating weight of being ignored became too heavy for my small chest to bear, I would hop on my second-hand bike, the one I bought after the blue one rusted away, and pedal as fast as I could to her house. We would sit together on a weathered wooden bench in the middle of her chaotic garden for hours. She rarely spoke much. She wasn't one for long, emotional lectures. Instead, she communicated through quiet observation. She would just point to the plants. She showed me how vines climbed, how certain flowers closed up tight during a harsh storm to protect their center, and how some seeds needed the absolute freezing cold of winter before they could finally germinate in the spring. I vividly remember one specific afternoon. I was 15, and I had just been screamed at by Victor because Wyatt had left a wet towel on the hardwood floor and ruined the finish, and, somehow, it was my fault for not picking it up fast enough. I was sitting on Opal's porch, crying tears of pure, furious frustration. Opal slowly walked out with 2 mugs of tea. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just pointed down at the cracked concrete pavement near the bottom step of her porch. Right there, pushing its way aggressively up through a thick, heavy slab of solid gray concrete, was a tiny, incredibly stubborn green weed. Opal looked at me, her voice papery thin but carrying the weight of a mountain. "You are exactly like that little plant, Cora," she said quietly. "You do not fight loud. You do not make a massive scene. But you will grow right through solid concrete to find the sun. They can pour all the cement they want over you, but they can't stop your roots." That phrase became the quiet mantra of my entire existence. When I was 26 years old, just a year after graduating college, Grandma Opal passed away in her sleep. The family funeral was exactly the kind of hollow, performative theater I expected. Rose wailed loudly for the audience, while Victor immediately began calculating the estate's value. The reading of her last will and testament took place a week later in a stuffy lawyer's office. The outcome was exactly what you would expect from the twisted dynamics of my family. Grandma Opal had possessed a significant amount of saved wealth, far more than her modest bungalow suggested. The lawyer read the distribution. Wyatt, the 30-year-old golden boy who still couldn't hold down a job for more than 6 months, was granted a massive, life-changing trust fund. A truly staggering amount of cash. The caveat was that because of Wyatt's demonstrated financial irresponsibility, Victor and Rose were appointed as the sole fiduciaries and managers of the trust until Wyatt turned 40. And me? The lawyer looked down at his paperwork, adjusted his glasses, and read my portion. I was bequeathed Grandma Opal's entire collection of handwritten journals, dating back 40 years, and her personal set of antique, perfectly maintained gardening and carpentry tools. The silence in the lawyer's office was thick. Victor and Rose exchanged a look of profound relief, acting as if this distribution was perfectly logical and fair. "Well, the journals are so very you, Cora," Rose cooed, patting my arm with a condescending smile. "You always did like reading old things. And the tools. Now you can use them with that big metal box your father gave you." How incredibly sweet of her. I didn't argue. I didn't cry about the money. I just picked up the heavy cardboard box containing decades of my grandmother's thoughts, packed up her worn wooden tool handles that still smelled faintly of her hands, and I left the office. I didn't care about the cash. I read those journals every single night in my tiny, rented apartment. They were filled with her quiet, piercing wisdom, her observations about human nature, and her deep understanding of the people in our family. And I used those tools. Every time I fixed a broken hinge or tightened a loose screw in my apartment, I felt her hands guiding mine. I knew, with absolute certainty, that she had given Wyatt the money because he was weak and needed it to survive. She gave me the tools and the knowledge because she knew I was strong enough to build my own empire from scratch. We are going to take a quick pause right here. If you are enjoying this story, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what city you are listening from. Every single comment helps the story reach more people, and I appreciate every single one of you. Alright, let's get back to it. A few years passed after Grandma Opal died. I was 27 years old, working an exhausting corporate communications job, and saving absolutely every single penny I could manage. I was not looking for a turnkey dream home with perfect landscaping and a modern kitchen. I was looking for an escape hatch. I was looking for a physical manifestation of my own independence, a place completely disconnected from the sterile, suffocating grip of my family. And then I found it. It was a 1920s craftsman-style house listed at a price so incredibly cheap it almost looked like a typographical error on the real estate website. The catch was obvious the moment you saw the address. It was located on the bad side of town, in a neighborhood most people actively avoided. And the house itself was an absolute, unmitigated wreck. The listing photographs were deliberately dark and blurry, trying to hide the severity of the damage. The front porch was literally collapsing inward, the wooden pillars rotting from the bottom up. The roof was missing shingles and actively leaking water into the upstairs bedrooms. The yard was a jungle of dead weeds and rusted scrap metal. Every single person who walked past that property saw rot, liability, and a massive financial loss. But when I walked through the heavy, jammed front door and stepped onto the dust-covered floors, I didn't see rot. I saw the bones. I saw that the foundation, despite the cosmetic nightmares above it, was incredibly solid. The thick, old-growth timber framework holding the house together was remarkably strong. This house was not a lost cause. It was just suffocating under decades of severe neglect and abandonment. Just like me. I did not just want to buy this house and hire a crew to fix it. I needed to save it with my own two hands. Because deep in my subconscious, my behavioral psychology training told me a profound truth. If I could manage to peel back the rot and save this broken, discarded house, maybe I could finally save myself. I drained my entire savings account for the down payment and took possession of the ruin. For the next 5 years, I poured absolutely everything I had into that structure. Every single paycheck, every free weekend, every holiday, and every ounce of my physical energy went into the restoration. I didn't have the budget for expensive general contractors, so I became my own. I used Grandma Opal's vintage tools and watched thousands of hours of online tutorial videos. I learned the incredibly frustrating, messy art of hanging heavy sheets of drywall, carefully taping the seams, and spreading the joint compound until my shoulders burned with lactic acid. I learned how to solder copper plumbing pipes, terrified the entire time that I would burn the historic house to the ground. It was an isolating, solitary existence, but for the first time in my entire life, the quiet was mine. It wasn't the heavy, anxious silence of waiting for Victor to explode. It was the peaceful silence of focused, meaningful labor. The physical toll of the renovation was immense. The most grueling task by far was dealing with the floors. The beautiful, original 1920s hardwood was completely hidden underneath 3 distinct, stubborn layers of toxic, yellowing linoleum that a previous owner had glued down decades ago. I spent entire weeks on my hands and knees. I used a heavy metal scraper and a toxic chemical solvent that burned my nostrils, slowly peeling back the ugly layers inch by agonizing inch. The scraper constantly slipped. I have dozens of tiny, faded white scars across my knuckles where the sharp metal sliced into my skin. There were nights when I sat in the middle of that empty, dusty room, my hands blistered and bleeding, my back screaming in pain, and I just cried. But they were not tears of defeat. They were tears of pure, physical exhaustion, and with every drop of sweat and blood that soaked into those floorboards, the house became more firmly tethered to my soul. But the physical labor wasn't the only obstacle I faced during those 5 years. During the 3rd year of the renovation, a strange, infuriating pattern began to emerge. Out of nowhere, city building inspectors started showing up at my property. The first time, an inspector arrived citing an anonymous complaint about illegal plumbing work. I had to halt my progress, open my walls, and prove that my permits were valid and my work was up to the strict municipal code. It passed perfectly. 2 months later, another inspector arrived. This time, it was an anonymous complaint about excessive construction noise during quiet hours, which was entirely fabricated because I only worked during the day. Then came an anonymous complaint about a structural hazard on the porch I had already completely rebuilt and stabilized. These inspections cost me precious time, money, and immense psychological stress. It felt like I was being watched, hunted by someone who desperately wanted me to fail, someone who wanted the city to condemn the property or find me into total bankruptcy, so I would be forced to sell it for pennies. It wasn't until a particularly sympathetic inspector accidentally let a detail slip that the terrifying truth was revealed. He casually mentioned that the caller had a very distinct, low, booming voice and had specifically referenced a stubborn daughter who was in way over her head. The blood rushed out of my face. It was Victor. My own father was intentionally calling city code enforcement to file false reports against my property. He was actively trying to sabotage my massive undertaking. He didn't just doubt me, he wanted to break me. He wanted the project to financially ruin me so I would come crawling back to his sterile house, begging for a loan, resuming my position as the helpless cleanup crew. Knowing this didn't make me quit. It injected my veins with absolute ice. I doubled my efforts, working late into the night with blackout curtains drawn, patching every single crack with meticulous, flawless precision before anyone could ever see it. Throughout the entire 5-year process, my parents visited the property exactly one single time. It was during the second year, right when the house looked its absolute worst. The walls were stripped to the wooden studs, thick electrical wires hung from the ceiling like dead snakes, and the air was thick with the choking smell of fine sawdust and damp plaster. Victor stood in the center of the half-finished living room, wearing a perfectly tailored suit. He looked up at the exposed ceiling beams, looked down at my dust-covered clothes, and let out a loud, mocking laugh. "You are going to burn yourself out fixing this absolute dump, Cora," he declared, shaking his head. "You are completely in over your head. You should have just rented a nice, clean apartment." Rose stood beside him, physically wrinkling her nose in deep disgust at the smell of the sawdust, carefully holding her expensive designer handbag close to her chest so it wouldn't touch anything dirty. "Well, at least Wyatt is working on something real," she remarked smoothly, referencing Wyatt's latest absurd startup venture that never seemed to actually start up anything except massive credit card debt. I didn't defend my home. I didn't argue. I just calmly handed them coffee in ceramic mugs I had shaped and glazed by my own hands. That night, after they finally drove away in their luxury SUV, I spent 4 hours hand-sanding the exact same wooden stair tread. As the wood slowly turned smooth like glass under my raw hands, I had a profound psychological realization. I had literally built a safe, warm home out of the exact same materials they constantly said would break me. And the house was standing tall. Fast forward to about 3 months before the disastrous dinner party. The renovations were finally complete. The house was stunning, a perfect blend of historic charm and modern strength. I had invited Wyatt and his new fiancée, Piper, over for a casual lunch. Wyatt spent the whole time complaining about the neighborhood, but Piper seemed oddly fascinated. A few weeks later, Piper texted me out of the blue, asking if she could drop by to bring me a fancy iced coffee and just bond as future sisters-in-law. I thought it was strange, given how timid she usually was around me, but I agreed. She arrived, handed me the drink, and asked if she could use the upstairs guest bathroom. 10 minutes passed. It was too long. I quietly walked up the carpeted stairs. I didn't hear the water running. Instead, I heard a soft, electronic beeping sound coming from the master bedroom. I silently pushed the door open. Piper was standing in the middle of my bedroom. She wasn't looking at the decor. She was holding a digital laser measure, calculating the square footage of the room. I watched in stunned silence as she quickly wrote the numbers down in a small notebook, then pulled out her phone and snapped 3 quick pictures of my restored original hardwood floors and the custom walk-in closet I had built. I stepped backward into the hallway before she turned around. I went downstairs and waited for her in the kitchen, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. When she came down, smiling her nervous, jittery smile, I thanked her for the coffee and showed her to the door. I didn't confront her that day. I went back up to my bedroom, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at the floor. The family hadn't just suddenly decided at dinner that Wyatt needed my house. They had been actively plotting this hostile takeover for months. They had sent Piper in on a reconnaissance mission to measure my home for their future furniture. They looked at 5 years of my bleeding hands, my sweat, and my tears, and they genuinely believed it was simply an asset they were entitled to harvest. The demand came exactly 1 week after I dropped the single word no at the dinner table. It was a Wednesday afternoon. I was standing on a tall aluminum ladder in my living room, carefully applying a final coat of protective wax to the top edge of a window frame I had spent weeks restoring. The afternoon light was spilling through the clean glass in thin, dusty, golden stripes across the floorboards. It was perfectly peaceful. Then, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I climbed down the ladder, wiped the sweat off my forehead with the back of my wrist, and checked the screen. It was Victor. I swiped to answer, placing the phone to my ear without saying a word. Cora, his voice boomed through the speaker. It was entirely flat. It was practiced, cold, and horribly final. The fake, polite warmth he used during the dinner party performance was completely gone. Your mother and I are deeply disappointed in your selfish behavior. You have put this family in a very difficult position. I remained completely silent. I just stood there, listening to the steady sound of my own breathing echoing in the empty room. Wyatt needs that house significantly more than you do. He repeated the exact same line from dinner, speaking as if this was a simple, undeniable fact of nature, like the law of gravity. If you do not sign the deed over to your brother by this Friday at noon, we will see you in court. The word court echoed sharply through the phone speaker. He was threatening to sue me, his own flesh and blood daughter. He mistook my continued silence on the line for fear. He mistook it for the weakness of the 8-year-old girl with the bloody dustpan. We paid for every single meal you ate as a child, Victor roared, his voice suddenly cracking with a terrifying surge of narcissistic rage. We paid for the roof over your head. We own every single success you have ever had in your pathetic life. That house is morally ours, not yours. We will take it. He hung up, the line clicking dead. I stood there in the absolute quiet of my house. The house I had saved. The house I had built with my own hands. That was the exact psychological breaking point. That was the precise moment I permanently stopped being their daughter and officially started being their opponent. I calmly put my tools away, picked up my car keys, and drove straight to the downtown business district. Ms. Dalton's law office smelled like old paper, black ink, and cold, bitter coffee. It was a sharp, highly sterile environment that felt completely unbothered by human emotion. Ms. Dalton herself was a fiercely sharp woman in her late 50s, wearing a no-nonsense tailored blazer. She had eyes that didn't just look at you, they assessed your structural integrity. I sat down in the leather chair across from her massive desk. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I simply opened my heavy canvas tote bag and pulled out a massive, 5-inch thick, heavy-duty 3-ring binder. This is my house, I said, sliding the heavy binder across the polished wood of her desk. It represents a 5-year restoration project. I have included the original bill of sale from 5 years ago. I have included the official property deed, which is fully and exclusively in my name. Behind tab 3 is a separate, meticulously itemized ledger of every single receipt for raw materials and professional labor. It is all explicitly cross-referenced with 5 years of my personal bank statements, which are located in the back section. The property was recently appraised at exactly $800,000. Ms. Dalton looked at the massive binder, then slowly raised one eyebrow at me. Then I told her the entire story. I recounted the dinner party demand, the psychological history of Wyatt's golden boy status, Victor's telephone ultimatum, the threat of a massive lawsuit, and finally, I quoted Victor's closing argument word for word. That regardless of legal ownership, the house was morally theirs because they fed me as a child. Ms. Dalton stared at me for a long moment. Her face remained a completely blank canvas. She slowly opened the binder and skimmed the first 20 pages. She saw the deed, the mortgage payoff statements, and the flawless paper trail of my financial independence. She was silent for a full minute. The only sound in the office was the ticking of a large clock on the wall. Then, Ms. Dalton laughed. It wasn't a polite giggle. It wasn't a soft chuckle. It was a sharp, dry, barking cackle that filled the entire room. It was the terrifying sound of pure, unadulterated legal confidence. "I am so sorry," she said, wiping a tiny tear of amusement from the corner of her eye. "It is just morally theirs." "That is hilarious." She leaned forward, her eyes suddenly turning as sharp and cold as broken glass. "Cora, let me be crystal clear with you. Their legal argument is that they fed you when you were a minor. Their moral claim to an $800,000 property is worth exactly $0.00. What you have handed me," she firmly tapped the heavy binder with her pen, "is an ironclad, airtight, beautiful fortress." I exhaled a long, shaky breath. "So, what exactly do we do now?" Ms. Dalton's smile vanished, replaced by a look of predatory, clinical precision. "We do absolutely nothing," she said smoothly. "We let them strike first. We let them file their ridiculous, legally baseless lawsuit, and then we bury them." I drove back to my house that evening, but the psychological atmosphere inside my mind was entirely different now. The cold, heavy anger was still present, but it wasn't just a low hum of anxiety anymore. It had crystallized into a razor-sharp purpose. My home, the sanctuary I had painstakingly built for my own peace, instantly transformed into a heavily fortified command center. Ms. Dalton was absolutely right. It was my fortress. I followed her strict legal instructions to the letter. I spent 3 days digitizing every single paper receipt, uploading them to 3 separate encrypted cloud servers. I meticulously labeled hundreds of before and after photographs of the renovation. I saved the threatening voicemails from Victor into a secure, backed-up audio file. And then, exactly as my behavioral psychology textbooks predicted when a narcissist is denied their supply, the noise campaign officially began. It wasn't just Victor and Rose attacking me directly anymore. They had officially unleashed the flying monkeys. In psychological terms, flying monkeys are the enablers, the extended family members and friends who are manipulated by the narcissist into doing their dirty work, harassing the target into submission to maintain the family's toxic status quo. First came a lengthy text message from my Aunt Martha. "Cora, dear. I heard about this terrible misunderstanding regarding the property. Your parents love you so much. They are aging. You should really just do what they ask, give Wyatt the house, and keep the peace in the family. Don't be greedy." Then came a highly aggressive email from my Uncle Thomas. "You are making this situation significantly worse than it needs to be, Cora. Think of your father's reputation in the community. Think of the family name. You are acting completely unhinged." Even Piper, the fiancé who had secretly measured my bedroom, sent me a teary, highly manipulative audio message. "Cora, I just don't know what is going on with you. Wyatt is so incredibly stressed. Can't you just give the house to him? For me? For the future of our family? You are tearing everyone apart with your selfishness. Tearing everyone apart." I sat in my living room and listened to that audio message, feeling a brief, sickening wave of nausea. For over 3 decades, that exact kind of coordinated, suffocating noise would have easily been my prison. The crushing weight of their collective disapproval, their weaponized disappointment, it would have absolutely destroyed my resolve. I would have folded under the pressure. I would have tearfully apologized for causing trouble. I would have handed Victor the keys to my $800,000 house just to make the screaming stop, just to buy a temporary, fake peace. But something fundamental inside my brain had shifted. Ms. Dalton's sharp, confident cackle in that office had permanently broken the spell of their authority. I did not reply to a single text message. I did not return a single frantic phone call. I did not engage in their manufactured drama. Instead, I calmly and methodically took a clear screenshot of every single text message, every social media comment, and every guilt-tripping email. I printed them all out on crisp white paper. I created a brand new, empty digital folder on my laptop desktop, and I labeled it with one single word: noise. I dropped every single file into that folder. I sat there in my quiet, beautifully lit study, looking at that little yellow folder icon on my screen. All of their heavy weapons, all of their generational guilt, all of their projected shame had been completely neutralized and reduced to a single, pathetic, silent digital file. I realized in that exact moment that true power was never loud. Power was not Victor's booming, terrifying roar in the dining room or Rose's high-pitched whining. Power was the absolute, quiet certainty that comes from knowing the objective truth, holding the receipts, and silently daring someone to cross the line and challenge it. I was no longer the little girl with the bloody dustpan. I was the architect of my own reality. Let them scream. The official legal summons arrived at my front door via a process server on a rainy Tuesday morning. Victor and Rose had actually done it. They had formally filed a lawsuit against me in civil court, claiming a breach of an implied oral family contract and demanding the immediate transfer of the property deed. Despite knowing my case was an ironclad fortress holding the actual, physical court documents bearing my parents' names as the plaintiffs against me sent a sharp, agonizing jolt of adrenaline through my nervous system. It was one thing to be angry at family. It was an entirely different universe to be legally sued by the people who gave you life. A lawsuit was real. It was public. It was a formal declaration of war. I felt a sudden, terrifying wave of panic wash over me. I felt incredibly small again. I couldn't focus on my remote work. I couldn't eat. I just paced the floors of my house until my eyes eventually landed on the tall oak bookshelf in my study. On the very top shelf, sitting right next to my heavy college psychology textbooks, were Grandma Opal's weathered journals. I pulled a random volume down. I wasn't actively looking for legal evidence. I wasn't searching for a weapon to use in court. I was just desperately looking for her. I needed that familiar feeling of grounded strength, that quiet reminder that I could grow through the concrete they were trying to pour over me. I sat on the floor and began reading her familiar, looping cursive script. I read stories about her garden, her frustrations with the weather, and then I casually flipped a page and stopped dead. It was an entry dated exactly 10 years ago. It was written during the exact same month Wyatt had failed out of university and miraculously received his brand new, expensive silver sedan. It was also the exact same year Victor and Rose had completely gutted and remodeled their massive kitchen and built a luxury outdoor deck. I read Grandma Opal's words, my heart hammering in my chest. Victor and Rose came by the house today. They are so incredibly proud of Wyatt's new car. They're officially managing his trust fund now. Of course, I worry constantly. Victor was always terribly loose with money, always chasing status. I happened to see a bank statement left open on their kitchen counter yesterday. It showed a very large, highly unusual withdrawal from the main trust account. When I asked, Victor got defensive and said it was a brilliant new investment opportunity in the technology sector. I truly hope they are right. Wyatt is a sweet boy, but he is completely unready for the harsh realities of the world. I froze. My mind raced backward, connecting the historical dots. 10 years ago. That specific month was early April. I remembered studying that specific economic period in my university finance elective. There had been a massive, sudden market panic in early April that year, causing high-risk technology stocks to violently crash before eventually recovering months later. A cold, awful, and utterly brilliant theory formed in my mind. Victor wasn't a financial genius. He was a narcissist who panicked. What if Victor had heavily invested Wyatt's trust fund money into high-risk stocks to try and double it for his own ego, lost a massive fortune during the early April crash, and then panicked? I immediately pulled out my own meticulously kept financial records. I cross-referenced the dates of their luxury kitchen remodel and the purchase of Wyatt's silver sedan. The dates perfectly aligned with the massive withdrawal Grandma Opal had seen on the counter. I picked up my phone and called Ms. Dalton immediately. Miss Dalton, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, I am looking at Grandma Opal's journals. I think I found something massive. I need you to legally subpoena the complete financial records for Wyatt's trust fund. The one my parents managed as fiduciaries. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. On what legal grounds, Cora? Grandma Opal suspected severe misappropriation of funds, I replied. She explicitly documented a massive, unexplained withdrawal that perfectly coincides with a major market crash and my parents suddenly buying luxury items. I think they stole his money. Another pause. But this one was entirely different. It was the distinct, terrifying sound of a shark smelling fresh blood in the water. I will get a judge to sign the subpoena this afternoon, she said, hanging up. Ms. Dalton called me back exactly 1 week later. When I answered the phone, her usually brisk, professional voice was completely devoid of its normal sharp edge. It was replaced by a tone of pure, absolute ice. Cora, she said slowly. I hired an independent forensic accountant to review the subpoenaed trust fund records. His name is Mr. Preston. We just finished the financial autopsy. I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter. And? They didn't just mismanage the trust fund due to incompetence, Cora. They didn't just lose it in a bad stock market panic. They actively emptied it. Every single last cent is completely gone. I felt my knees go weak. I sank into a kitchen chair. They drained it to pay for his silver car and their luxury kitchen remodel? Oh yes, Ms. Dalton replied. They used the trust as their own personal piggy bank to fund their lifestyle when their investments tanked. But here is the truly twisted, sociopathic part, Cora. I pulled the original distribution records from the estate lawyer. The trust was legally set up to be split into 2 parts. Wyatt's massive cash portion was to be managed by Victor and Rose. Your portion, as we know, was the physical journals and the old tools. I know that, I said, confused. Everyone knew that. You do, Miss Dalton said, her voice dropping lower, sounding like a razor blade. But Cora, I would bet my entire license to practice law that Victor and Rose lied to your brother. Based on the paper trail and the psychological profile we are dealing with, they told Wyatt the trust cash was split evenly between the 2 of you. They told him you received your half in secret and he received his. And then, when Victor and Rose secretly spent every single dollar of Wyatt's money, they convinced him that you were the one who got the massive inheritance and he got nothing. I felt the blood completely drain from my face. The room started to spin. That is exactly why he thinks he needs the house, I whispered, the horrifying realization crashing down on me. Wyatt thinks the house is rightfully his. He thinks I bought this house with Grandma Opal's money. He thinks it is what he is owed to balance the scales. Exactly, Ms. Dalton said. Victor and Rose stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from their own son, used it to fund their fake wealthy lifestyle, and then deliberately pointed you and your brother at each other like loaded weapons. They used you as the scapegoat to hide their federal crimes. This is not just a civil countersuit anymore, Cora. This is massive financial fraud. This is severe tax evasion. We have them completely dead to rights. I hung up the phone and stared blankly at the wall. The absolute magnitude of their emotional and financial bankruptcy was staggering. They hadn't just neglected me. They had actively engineered a decade-long war between siblings simply to cover up their own pathetic greed. The final confrontation did not take place in a dusty courtroom. It took place at a highly neutral location, a private, expensive dining room reserved in a high-end local restaurant. It was exactly the kind of pretentious place Victor loved, filled with dark mahogany wood, heavy velvet curtains, and the distinct, suffocating smell of old money. Victor and Rose had explicitly requested this location. They called the meeting a mediation. In their arrogant minds, they fully believed they were walking into an ambush. They thought they had their expensive lawyer ready to aggressively bully me, a terrified 32-year-old woman, into tearfully signing over my $800,000 house to avoid a public trial. They had absolutely no idea that I was the one setting the trap. I walked into the private room first. Victor, Rose, their smug lawyer, and Wyatt were already seated around the massive table. They all looked incredibly confident. Cora, Victor boomed, adjusting his expensive tie. Excellent. You are finally being sensible and acting like an adult. Hello, Victor, I replied flatly. The heavy wooden door opened behind me. Ms. Dalton walked in, carrying a massive, thick black briefcase. Right behind her walked another man, someone my family did not recognize. He was a stone-faced, humorless man wearing a cheap gray suit. He looked like he had not smiled a single time since 1998. Who are they? Rose asked, her artificial, tight smile immediately faltering. This is my legal counsel, Ms. Dalton, I said smoothly, taking my seat. And this, I gestured to the stoic man, is Mr. Preston. He is a certified forensic accountant. The color instantly drained from Victor's face. His jaw went slack. Wyatt just looked around the room, completely confused by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. There is absolutely nothing to mediate regarding accounting, Victor's lawyer blustered, trying to regain control of the room. Ms. Cora, your parents are prepared to be very generous and drop the lawsuit if you sign the deed today. No, Ms. Dalton said, her voice cutting through the warm air like a frozen machete. She sat down, unlatched her briefcase with a loud click, and opened it. We are not here to mediate anything today. We are here to explicitly present your clients with their only remaining options. She slid a thick white folder across the polished table. This is our official countersuit, completely dismissing your highly frivolous claim. It includes every single receipt, every bank transfer, and every notarized affidavit proving beyond a shadow of a doubt my client's 100% ownership of the property. Their lawyer opened the folder, skimmed the first page, and his face went totally pale. He looked at Victor with thinly veiled panic. And this, Ms. Dalton continued, sliding a second, significantly thicker red folder across the table directly toward Victor. This is where the situation becomes criminal. Victor stared down at the red folder like it was a live venomous snake. He didn't touch it. Those documents, Mr. Preston said, speaking for the very first time. His voice was a flat, monotone gravel that commanded absolute terror. Are the complete, unredacted financial records for the Wyatt Trust Fund. The specific trust fund that you, Victor and Rose, managed as legal fiduciaries for the past 10 years. Rose let out a small, high-pitched gasp, slapping her hand over her mouth. Wyatt finally looked up from his phone, his brow furrowed. What? What about my trust fund? The one you guys said was mismanaged by the bank. The one your parents explicitly told you was lost? I asked, looking my brother directly in his eyes for the first time in years. Ms. Dalton relentlessly pressed the attack. This red file contains verified bank transfers showing a total of $280,000 explicitly withdrawn by your parents over a 3-year period. It includes direct withdrawals matching the exact purchase price of your silver vehicle, Wyatt. It also includes massive withdrawals exactly matching the full remodeling costs of your parents' kitchen and their luxury outdoor deck. You absolutely cannot prove that. Victor stammered, his booming voice completely shattering into a pathetic squeak. And finally, Ms. Dalton said, entirely ignoring Victor's panic. We have included copies of your federal tax filings for those specific years. Curiously, you never declared any of those massive trust fund withdrawals as personal income. The Internal Revenue Service finds that kind of creative accounting highly illegal. The private dining room was dead silent. The suffocating tension was unbearable. Wyatt finally snapped. He slammed his hands on the table. This is completely ridiculous. Wyatt yelled, looking frantically at our parents. It's all lies. Cora is just twisting everything because she got all of Grandma's money to buy her stupid house. I looked at my brother. The golden boy. The one who was supposed to have everything handed to him. I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt an overwhelming, crushing wave of exhaustion. They spent your trust fund, Wyatt, I said, my voice incredibly quiet but piercing the silence. The money Grandma Opal explicitly left for you to survive. They spent every single dollar of it to cover Victor's bad stock investments and to remodel their kitchen. And then, 10 years later, they came to steal my house because they realized they finally had to give you something of value to keep you quiet. I paused, letting the truth sink into his brain. They told you I got all the money, didn't they? They explicitly told you Grandma left the cash to me, and that's how I bought my house. Wyatt's face, his famously smug, incredibly confident, arrogant face, just completely crumbled. He turned slowly to look at Victor and Rose. They wouldn't meet his eyes. They stared firmly at the table, radiating profound guilt. Piper, the fiancé who had secretly measured my bedroom, looked at Wyatt, her eyes wide with absolute horror. "Wyatt," she whispered. "Is this true? You don't have any money." He didn't answer her. He just kept staring at our parents, his reality entirely shattered. Piper stood up from her chair. She slowly pulled the expensive diamond engagement ring off her finger. She placed it carefully on the center of the mahogany table with a small, sharp click. In that silent room, the sound of the ring hitting the wood was louder than any screaming match. She turned around and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Ms. Dalton loudly snapped her heavy briefcase shut. "You have exactly 48 hours, Ms. Dalton said, her voice completely void of all human emotion. "You will formally drop the lawsuit against my client. You will sign this legally binding repayment agreement, with heavy interest, for the full amount you stole from your son. And you will file amended tax returns. If you do not execute all of these actions by noon on Friday, we bypass civil court and we go directly to federal authorities." Rose finally broke. She began to wail. It wasn't a sad cry, it was a loud, theatrical, deeply ugly sound of a narcissist realizing their entire fake empire had just collapsed. Victor just sat there, staring blankly at the legal documents. His face was a deep, mottled, unhealthy red, looking as if the papers might spontaneously catch fire. I stood up. The wooden legs of my chair scraped softly against the floor. "I came here today to give you one final chance," I said to the room, my voice steady. "Not for forgiveness. This isn't about revenge. It is simply about accountability." I turned my back and walked out of the room. Ms. Dalton and Mr. Preston followed silently behind me. As the heavy wooden door slowly closed, I heard my father desperately shout my name. "Cora! Cora, wait!" For the very first time in my entire 32 years of life, I did not stop, and I did not turn back. That was 6 months ago. The ridiculous lawsuit against me was, of course, instantly dropped. The forced repayments to Wyatt's empty trust fund have officially begun. They are incredibly small, highly grudging monthly payments, but they arrive every single month. To afford the payments and the massive tax penalties, Victor and Rose were forced to sell their pristine, sterile house. Wyatt and Piper, needless to say, did not get married. My $800,000 house is incredibly quiet now. There are no threatening lawyers, no frantic phone calls, and no toxic family names echoing down my restored hallway. There is just the steady, peaceful drip of rain on the porch roof that I rebuilt, and the rich smell of damp earth blowing in from my garden. I spend my early mornings sitting on the front steps, drinking coffee, and watching the sunlight move slowly across the hardwood floors I bled to sand smooth. I walk through my garden, feeling the cool soil beneath my bare feet. I think about Grandma Opal's words frequently, how some roots are forced to violently break through thick concrete just to finally find the light. I run my hand along the wooden stair rail I spent a month perfectly restoring. The wood is smooth now. It is strong. Justice doesn't always roar like a lion. Sometimes it is not a massive, dramatic Hollywood explosion. Sometimes, justice just lingers in the air. It is the deep, quiet satisfaction of a heavy debt finally being paid. It waits patiently in the quiet, safe corners of houses built entirely from scratch by women who refuse to break. My family thought they could simply rewrite the history of what I built. They thought they could erase my labor. But walls remember. Floors remember. I remember. And now, the absolute silence in my sanctuary is the most beautiful sound in the entire world. But I have to ask you guys, am I the jerk here? Should I have just given Wyatt the house to keep the family intact, or was exposing our parents' massive financial fraud the only way to finally break the toxic cycle? What would you do if you were in my position? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you so much for watching and listening to my story. If this stayed with you, or if you just love watching toxic people get legally dismantled, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more. I'll see you in the next one.